Welcome everyone to my second ever challenge video. I'm sure many of you have already seen the first one about beating Kingdom Hearts 2 without Keyblade combos, considering it absolutely exploded while I was writing the script for this one. Anyway, I figured it might be fun to do another challenge and see how that goes. To be clear, I don't want to become a challenge run channel. However, these videos are still something I'd enjoy doing more of, every once in a while. I'm not interested in doing challenges that are frustratingly difficult, nor solely ones where I'm trying to find out if something outlandish is possible to accomplish. I'm not Game Champ 3000. I love watching videos like hers, but I'm not a fan of creating them. I instead want to focus on finding challenges that are enjoyable in similar ways to just playing the game normally, but that flip the mechanics on their head. Challenges that push the game without leaving Fate up to grinding, luck, or extremely obscure exploits. I want to find challenges that myself and the people watching can find fun to try, not just watch. That was the mindset for my original challenge video too. It's less about accomplishing something great and more about doing something rewarding and interesting that any of you can give a shot if you think it seems interesting. In comes this video. I'm not really a fan of Birth by Sleep. I find it extremely broken and repetitive. Despite this, I still have a fond nostalgia for the first time I played through it. While testing endlessly for more challenge videos I could do, I decided to try and see if there was a way I could make BBS more balanced, and therefore more enjoyable again for someone like myself. While I can't say this challenge totally fixes BBS's mechanical issues, I can definitely say that the game gets quite a bit more balanced and, for me, enjoyable when played this way. As you no doubt already know based on the title, the way I've decided to play BBS today is without commands, or more specifically, without battle commands. It's pretty common knowledge that your deck of battle commands is extremely overpowered in this game, particularly when using certain command types, so playing without it should be rather interesting to say the least. A few rules before we start. Rules, I should note that you're free to adjust however you see fit if you decide to try this for yourself. Do whatever makes it more fun for you. Rule 1 is simple. I'm not allowed to activate any battle commands in my deck. Obviously, some of you might be wondering why I'd even equip them if I'm not going to activate them. Well, rule number 2, I'm still allowed to equip, level, and meld battle commands for the sake of unlocking abilities, making money, or for anything else that doesn't activate them. Rule number 3, movement and shot lock commands aren't battle commands, so they're allowed. Sure, excluding them would be more difficult, but that doesn't sound particularly interesting for a video. Besides, people have already beaten Birth by Sleep's toughest challenges without any of these options, on critical mode at level 1. Nothing I do could top that, so I'd rather have some fun pushing the other mechanics on offer, giving them some breathing room they didn't originally have. Rule number 4. We'll be playing on critical mode, but not level 1. Lower difficulties simply aren't likely to provide the necessary challenge to flex my other options well. Also note that I'm personally choosing not to look at any speedrun strategies or anything like that for this video. Feel free to share speedrun strats you know of in the comments that you feel would have helped, or any other strategies for that matter. But please don't act like I'm dumb because I chose not to ruin the fun by researching optimal strategies myself. Remember, after all, the whole point is to make the game interesting to experiment with and explore, not obliterate the mechanics with perfect routing. And finally, rule number 5, I have to complete the story with every character as well as the final and secret chapters. Nothing optional is required because most of the optional fights in this game are broken, and I'm not interested in putting myself through that. Obviously, that means the entire game will be spoiled if you haven't played it yet. You have been warned. Before we start, a couple of notes about how this is likely to pan out. Firstly, though in reality I did these playthroughs one at a time, starting with Aqua, then Ventus, and finally Terra, we'll be jumping between the characters to compare them more directly. I started with Aqua in particular because I suspected she'd be the middle ground between Ventus as the most difficult and Terra as the easiest. You see, Birth by Sleep has a huge problem with damage scaling. It doesn't really scale anything at all. That means even when leveled properly, it's not uncommon for nearly every physical attack to do just a single point of damage when playing as Ventus and Aqua. Aqua can find a way around her chip damage problem later with her high magic skill, as long as she's not fighting an enemy that teleports out of attacks. And she can also use the Ventus D-Link, which when leveled up affords us the haste ability, making her combos extremely fast. Terra, meanwhile, hits much harder than the other two and can use the Ventus D-Link, likely making him by far the easiest for most of the run. Ventus, though, he's mediocre stat-wise and can't use his own D-Link, leaving him rather slow and vulnerable most of the way through. This makes fighting optional mobs along the way easier said than done. With no cure spells or healing items at our disposal, it's really easy to get knocked out, forcing us to reset to the beginning of a room. When each enemy can take upwards of 3 combos or more to dispose of because of our extremely low damage output, large rooms can sometimes take up to a half an hour to clear safely. Losing that progress by dying sucks, meaning that we sometimes have to skip a lot of the mobs, making us underleveled at points and potentially making our damage output even worse than it already was. I therefore occasionally had to grind a bit, though I only ever made up for the level deficit that was caused from running past entire rooms of enemies, rather than grinding to the point of being overleveled. Early on, battle commands will level slowly, meaning melding will be slow, but eventually every character will want to have HP boost, combo finish boost, defender, combo plus, air combo plus, damage siphon, second chance, once more, and the finish command, heal strike. Okay, so when we start in the prologue, we first have to make our way down to the tutorial area, and learn how to control Ventus before we can pick from the trio. First we learn how to smack things with our Keyblade. Directly afterwards, we're asked to use commands. Obviously though, we can just ignore it and... So when we start, we're immediately thrust into the character select screen. We could do a tutorial prologue, but all it does is give us some story and teach us how to use the mechanics, which we already know. It provides little value and is optional content, so we skip it. As I said before, I decided to go with Aqua as our first character, though all 3 characters begin the game at the Mark of Mastery exam, which provides little of interest or value, since it legitimately just requires hitting orbs for a few minutes. While it's probably possible to lose this fight, it's not likely, so whack away. Aqua's first world is the Castle of Dreams. We keep our starting commands equipped to get a head start on leveling for future melding. While we could immediately leave the foyer toward the courtyard, enemy mobs in the foyer are for the most part fairly weak, meaning we can take advantage of this chance to gain a bit of experience. But more importantly, we want to try and level up our D-Links. D-Links level up more or less randomly. Every time you kill an enemy in a D-Link, there's a chance that they'll drop a star, which will level that specific link up. You need 2 stars to level it fully, which will also change the finish command for that D-Link. Aside from the extra abilities, like the Ventus D-Link's aforementioned haste, D-Links also offer a full heal when you enter them. This can be exploited if you're not currently using a D-Link while exploring, because you can enter one at low health, get the heal, and then exit it, consuming almost none of your link meter. While you can only re-enter another D-Link when this meter is full again, defeating even just a single basic enemy will usually give you the necessary meter to fill it. If you're actually using D-Links, be aware that you can't stay in them forever. While you can keep them up for quite a while by defeating enemies, eventually the meter will start dropping faster and faster, until you can't possibly keep up. So it's generally better to drop out every once in a while, otherwise you might have to fight a decent chunk of enemies before you can use another link. Exiting and re-entering a world will fully fill it though, if you're near a save point. Luckily, I got haste pretty quickly, which in particular made the Bruiser on Verst easier, since I could usually get 2 whole combos off before they had a chance to attack. This also meant that there was a high chance I would stagger the Bruiser as well, effectively stun-locking them. We're left to our own devices for most of this world, meaning it's up to you whether you want to grind the corridor or courtyard, both of which are more dangerous but more lucrative than the foyer. I spent some time trying to level up the Ventus and Terra D-links, eventually getting Ventus's other ability, Auto Counter, and Terra's first ability, Overdrive, which raises Aqua's strength when her HP falls below 25%. While potentially useful, right now that's far too dangerous, since again, we have no easy way to heal. And since bosses don't drop D-Link orbs to recharge the meter, we can only enter D-Links once during most bosses, meaning we have to be a lot more deliberate in our use of the system. Once we're past the forest, we enter Cinderella's house. Skipping the cutscenes places us in a minigame of sorts, where we're tasked with escorting Jacques across a pretty large room between two mouse holes. This at first seems like it might be difficult, because we simply can't put down enough damage to easily deal with all of the enemies, unless we're completely perfect in our execution. However, there's actually an exploit we can use to trivialize this section. You see, Jacques will continue making progress as long as the enemies don't spawn to stop him in his tracks. Under normal circumstances, players are likely to follow close by Jacques to keep him safe. However, if we instead take out the first few enemies and then fall behind, we never get close enough to the rest of the enemy mob locations for them to spawn. That allows Jacques to just run right past them, then we simply catch up and finish the minigame. After this, we've already reached the boss of the world, the Cursed Coach. Because of our low health, inability to freely heal with Q or potions, and the fact that we're likely already doing just chip damage, this boss can be a threat. Thankfully, its patterns are fairly simple to avoid if we have patience. Shotlocks are a good way to get free damage and should be used more or less whenever the shotlock is full enough to max out the attack. You're invincible during the entire attack, and if unlike me you already have it leveled to at least level 2, it will do an extra attack at the end to further boost damage output. Otherwise, your main goal is simply to wait for one of the boss's more direct attacks to start, and then you block it and do the scripted counter. Doing so will often stagger the boss, dropping HP orbs and giving you the chance to do a bit of damage yourself. It's up to you whether you want to use your Ventus D-Link specifically to put out more damage, or if you want to wait until you need a heal. Occasionally, the boss will spawn a few mob enemies, but as long as you don't get too close, they don't actually do anything. In this case, I decided to keep the D-Link for the heal, and ended up not needing it. Defeating this boss finishes the world and gets us the Stroke of Midnight Keyblade. Birth by Sleep was rather regressive with how it handled Keyblades, making them primarily just increasingly powerful beating rods. However, early story Keyblades will usually either add a bit of magic or add a bit of strength, but rarely both. As such, early on we want to focus on strength, since we'll primarily be hitting things with physical attacks. Later on, Aqua can do a pretty decent job with magic-centric Keyblades, but for now, it's best if we do everything we can to avoid chip damage. Stroke of Midnight itself just makes critical hits more likely, so we equip it. Once we're prepared, we enter Dwarf Woodlands. After arriving and grabbing a few treasure chests nearby, we head to the command shop. Again, while we're not using commands for combat, it's still nice to get a head start on melding. All I could afford though was a single thunder, so that's what I grabbed. Since I mentioned exactly what abilities we're going after at the start, I won't bring up each time we can meld a new ability or what we're going for. That's up to each individual player anyway, since you're free to go after whatever abilities you have the materials for. In the next area, we find more chests and fight some optional mobs in an attempt to level our remaining D-Links, Terra and Cinderella. The following screens, and by that I mean the entire rest of the world, are more of the same, not having a single required fight along the way, so we play it by ear. The only major thing of note here is the danger that this boss can pose to us, and how much progress you can lose if you enter the boss right after clearing out the previous screen. This section takes a while to clear out, and if you're struggling with the boss and decide to do some grinding or melding to help, you'll quickly realize that hitting continue instead of retry undoes all of your progress on the previous screen. So if you do plan to clear it out for experience, make sure to head back up top to the exit and re-enter the screen so that your checkpoint is updated to reflect that. I initially tried this challenge back in like October of 2020, and ended up stopping right here because that happened, losing me about 30 minutes worth of experience, so don't make that mistake. The boss itself, Spirit of the Magic Mirror, hits rather hard, and can easily kill you in less than a second, making it a serious threat. However, as long as you're paying attention, you should be able to avoid 100% of the damage it dishes. He basically has 5 major attacks. The first one sees him going high into the air and then diving down to crash through you. This is probably the attack you're most likely to survive. Next is a variant of this where he'll start zigzagging toward you. Depth perception on this attack can be a bit difficult because of the background, but it shouldn't be too challenging to time a guard. You can spam the cartwheel for total invincibility, but that seemed kinda cheap this early on, so I avoided doing so. The third attack sees him diving in and out of the ground, shooting slow projectiles that can confuse you. This isn't too big of a deal, but it can make countering once he's done very difficult. The fourth attack has the boss duplicating itself and surrounding you. You cannot escape it first. Instead, just find the one mask that has a ripple under it when it comes out of the ground. This mask should also be the only one that's smiling. Keep it in your sights. When they stop spinning, they'll all shoot fireballs at you. Being Aqua means we can use the barrier block to negate them all, then rush over to the smiling mask to punish. The final attack is similar, except you'll find yourself in between 2 infinite walls of masks. Spam cartwheels so that you're moving faster than they can aim to easily avoid the fireballs as you search both sides. Once again, the correct mask that you're supposed to hit will be smiling. Getting to the mask fast enough after any of these attacks will allow you to do a couple of combos of punishment. Shotlock isn't worth it this time since it takes too long to dish out, though we can still use the Ventus D-Link as both a free heal when necessary and for his insanely quick combos. Winning gives us the Snow White D-Link and the Treasure Trove Keyblade. This Keyblade has an extra point in strength, so we toss it on. Enchanted Dominion once again starts with very little fanfare. The first few screens are ones we're just allowed to run through, and while you can try to level up here, it's rather dangerous for Aqua because of the amount of damage Maleficent's little guys can do. Eventually, we reach our first mandatory fight in a while, which has us defeating a bunch of these guards with, Prince Philip, apparently. Yeah, okay, so with Prince Philip by our side, what seems like an insanely difficult fight turns into a much more manageable one. Philip does a lot of damage to the enemies, and when he's knocked out, he'll wake up pretty quickly. So while you can help him here and there by poking enemies, it's honestly best to just stay out of the way entirely. You see, in any battle where you have allies by your side, using D-Links is inexplicably impossible. This means our only way of healing is through health orbs, and we can't speed our combos up by using the Ventus D-Link. Meanwhile, unless your Shotlock is a high enough level to acquire targets super fast by this point, even this is a bit too dangerous to use consistently, so just focus on staying out of the battle where possible. After this, we get an even harder variant with arrow guys shooting from above and dudes throwing rocks. The same idea still applies, however, you just have to be extra careful. When you get the chance to team up, do so, allowing you to progress further. If you're lucky, this won't take too many tries, and along the way we can get a new Shotlock, Absolute Zero. Once that's done, there are a few more screens we're free to explore at our own pace before the boss. Depending on how you look at it, we're either luckily or unluckily graced once again with Philip's presence for our fight against Dragon Maleficent. This is probably the first real challenge, since again, with Philip by our side, we can't use the Ventus D-Link as a heal or to speed up combos. You can't even use Cinderella's regen ability if you have her D-Link leveled up. This means we have no way to heal whatsoever. You've got to run what you brung, as they say. And Prince Philip doesn't do near as much damage this time around, though it's still decent. After a few failed attempts, I decided to go do some leveling, since despite being at the boss of the third world, I was still only level 5. So I went back to the first world and grinded a bit until I reached level 8, had the Bubble Blaster Shotlock maxed out, and had a few combo pluses. Immediately after the battle starts, rush to the side of Maleficent. If you don't get too close to her leg, she'll usually use Fire Breath that will completely miss you. Hopefully your Bubble Blaster is at least level 2 by this point, because this gives you the chance to fully charge it, which will do a decent chunk of damage. If she instead uses her set of double stomps or her single giant stomp, you're gonna have to be a bit more precise with your shotlock charge, but it can be done. Nearly every attack Maleficent does can 1 or 2 shot you, even if you've leveled a bit, so be careful. If you're lucky, you'll eventually get 2 shotlocks off. At some point, Philip will beckon for you in the center of the arena. Quickly get behind him because Maleficent will soon shoot fire breath, burning everything but what's behind his shield to a crisp. To stop this attack, Philip will ask you to engage in a QuickTime event. Doing so launches Aqua up into the air, where she can smash down on Maleficent's face to stop her stank breath from flooding the arena. At this point, you should have enough time for another shotlock, if you have the focus gauge for it. When Maleficent is at about half health, she'll take flight. Once again, head toward Philip, who will eventually have another QuickTime event ready for you. This time, the attack leaves Aqua on Maleficent's back, allowing you to get in a couple of combos before you're forced off. After this, the majority of the time Maleficent will briefly land and do a couple of swipes before then taking flight again. This process simply repeats until she's done for. You still have to be careful because she can take you out so quickly, but since it's safe to combo her whenever you're on her back, you're also able to regain some focus gauge for more shotlocks if you can find an opportunity to charge one. Beating this world awards you with the Fairy Stars Keyblade. This drops your strength back to what it was before you equipped the treasure trove, but it offers you an extra point in magic. At this point, that's not particularly useful. Up next would normally be Radiant Garden, but first I think we should take a detour to compare how the other two got on in their versions of these 3 worlds. Let's start with Ventus, who, after hitting a few orbs, begins in Dwarf Woodlands. Remember, Ventus is less adept at magic than Aqua, but is supposed to be slightly better with physical attacks. This should theoretically help us, since we primarily have to attack with our Keyblade. But in practice, for most of the game, Ventus actually ends up still struggling with chip damage. Thankfully, he also has a really powerful dodge, just like Aqua's. But his block is more traditional, meaning he has to be facing an enemy to successfully guard against their attacks. I'd argue in some ways Ventus is the hardest of the trio, in large part thanks to the fact that he can't use his own D-Link, meaning we have no options to massively speed up our attacks, still further lowering our damage per second. It also makes enemies like the Bruisers more dangerous, because our basic combo finishers rarely stagger them. And because those finishers have such a long cooldown before we can guard, it's very likely they'll retaliate before we can do anything about it. Our first task in Dwarf Woodlands starts when we reach the heart of the mine, and are tasked with finding all of the 7 dwarves hiding in boxes and such. Hitting boxes the dwarves aren't in will spawn unversed, but that's not too big of a deal. This goes by pretty simply. Afterwards, we're free to go through the rest of the world at our own pace. Eventually we'll come across Snow White, and the game asks us to escort her through the woods. Unversed come from all angles, and many of the trees come alive to attack. This isn't as easy as when we escorted Jacques, because I couldn't figure out a way to get Snow White to run ahead without Unversed spawning and stopping her. So this time we actually have to escort her. Chip damage is by far our biggest enemy here, but Snow White can offer us a reaction command that blasts away enemies for a fair chunk of damage, and that seems to immediately defeat the tree enemies. We just barely make it out on our first try, thankfully meaning we don't have to do the whole section again. Once we're done with that, it's time for the world boss already, the Mad Treant. Our shotlock is relatively useful here, since the boss isn't particularly mobile as long as he doesn't jump. I decided to use the Terra D-Link just in case I got to low health and could use his overdrive ability to boost damage. That never actually happened though, because the boss didn't really put up much of a fight. A few of his attacks are dangerous, like when he rains bombs down on us, but more often than not he chose to do not much of anything, allowing me to repeatedly knock him out for free health orbs. With that done, so is the world itself. Next up is Castle of Dreams. Once again, there are a few screens we're free to explore however we please. In time, we'll be asked to find a bunch of materials for Cinderella's dress. This requires us to explore the entire world pretty thoroughly, but we can do it however we like. Once that's done, we're legitimately already at the boss, Lucifer the cat. I figured this boss might be a bit challenging because Lucifer loves to leap onto shelves and then pounce on us. Dodging this can be a bit precise if you're not just spamming the roll, but for the most part, Kitty plays nice. Our leveled shotlock did loads of damage, and the ball of fur doesn't really retaliate when we smack it in the face. Probably the easiest boss we've done so far. Last up for Ventus before we move on to Terra is Enchanted Dominion. We aren't actually forced to do anything specific in this world until we're most of the way through it, where we're asked to defeat a mob of Maleficent's cronies by ourselves. This means D-Links are allowed, but these guys can be dangerous enough that it's smarter to save that option for a heal. I eventually chose Cinderella since her area of effect finisher seemed like it would help a lot. Thankfully, it did just that. After going through a maze and watching a few cutscenes, we're at the final fight with Maleficent herself. Using the absolute zero shotlock on her does enormous damage, even when it's still level 1. Getting it off though is difficult since she loves to teleport around this massive arena. But overall, she really doesn't do too much offensively that we can't easily avoid, meaning it's just a matter of time until she goes down as long as we play relatively safe. The best place to use your shotlock is when it asks you to do a button pressing minigame, which if successful will put Maleficent to sleep for a few seconds. This can see you shaving half a health bar off or more. Once she's done with, we grab the Fairy Star's Keyblade and move on. Before we switch to Terra though, we have one more fight with Ventus in the Badlands. Fortunately, we don't do awful damage to Ventus with our combo attacks. Unfortunately, he often refuses to sit still long enough for us to land more than even a single attack before he teleports away. This battle more or less has two phases. The first phase sees us alone with Ventus. It ends when we take a certain amount of damage. We are then healed as Mickey joins us and the battle restarts. It's best to try and do as much damage as you can to Ventus before Mickey shows up, because that damage is retained, but ours isn't. It effectively serves as our one and only free heal because Mickey's presence prevents us from using D-Links. What's more, shotlocks in this battle range from being fairly okay at putting down damage to completely useless. There's no rhyme or reason to it either, since it all depends on whether Ventus feels like dodging everything or not. Luckily, since I'd finished Aqua's playthrough before Ventus, I had a bit of a plan in mind. I left the battle, went and leveled a few of our commands to meld some abilities, and also leveled something else. Birth by Sleep has special finishers that will show up if you max out the command bar, but didn't use any battle commands to get there. As you fulfill certain requirements, you can gain more of these finishers over time. Well, it turns out, Ventus is at the point now where he can gain the most useful finisher in this run, Heal Strike. Simply using Second Chance or Once More to survive 5 attacks that would normally defeat you, while you have the Air Flare 1 finisher equipped, will unlock Heal Strike. Heal Strike heals your character for a decent amount of HP, twice across the finisher. Doing both heals guarantees that you'll leave critical HP even if you only had 1 HP left. That then reactivates Second Chance and Once More. And this happens whether or not you actually hit the enemy with the attacks. In both the playthrough with Terra and with Ventus, this will become a powerful part of our arsenal, though with Aqua I didn't get it until much later. So I level commands and meld them to get Second Chance and Once More, and then use that to unlock Heal Strike before heading back to the Ventus fight for round 2. Whenever Mickey is about to get attacked and we're close by, we can press square when prompted, which will teleport us in front of Mickey, block the attack, and then allow us to activate a special attack called Avenger Rush. This pretty consistently dishes out a large amount of damage. He can also occasionally call you over to do a spinning energy attack, Burst of Faith, that is far less consistent. Sometimes Ventus just stands in it and takes damage. Other times he teleports through it the entire time, and still other times he'll never enter it to begin with. What's more, exiting it is so slow and clunky that using this can be dangerous because Ventus will often queue up several attacks while you're recovering from Burst of Faith. Mickey himself will also do okay damage and can survive for quite a while before going down. Once he does though, he'll be down for like 10 seconds or so, which isn't a long time, but can be dangerous since Ventus will focus entirely on Ventus. Ventus's attacks are mostly pretty easy to avoid, as long as you're not in the middle of a combo when he uses them. Combos are incredibly dangerous thanks to his teleports, so the best option is to slowly time your combo hits so that you can easily catch a teleport before you get stuck in another attack animation and get punished. His most dangerous attack is his Dark Fireball. The base Fireball can do a decent amount of damage if it hits you, but once it separates, speeds up, and starts homing in on you, getting hit will pretty much always guarantee a death. So try to stay close to Ventus and roll around him when this happens, because the homing properties of the fireballs aren't strong enough to keep up. Ventus's slash attacks are generally real easy to avoid if you're playing it safe, meaning his only remaining option is to jump into the air and shoot Dark Lightning at you. Your goal in this fight should be to focus on staying as safe as possible. Poke Ventus where you can, and if possible gain access to Heal Strike and then save it for when it's necessary. You can hold on to Heal Strike by shifting more heavily toward trying to get shot locks, the Avenger Rush counter, and letting Mickey do some of the work. Particularly if you've got Flame Salvo leveled a bit, it should do a decent job of whittling Ventus down. This is definitely the most difficult battle we've seen so far, but it's more than doable. For winning, we forge a D-Link with Mickey. And now we can finally move on to Terra, whose first world is Enchanted Dominion, again after he hits some glowing orbs for a minute or two. Terra is a bit different from the other two, in that he hits far harder, but he has a much less exploitable dodge. His dodge actually has recovery frames, meaning using it flippantly will likely get you killed. Thankfully though, he has the Ventus D-Link, which turns him into an absolute monster. So we start by leveling that as fast as possible. Thankfully, we get it leveled fairly quickly in this run. Once we reach the castle, we gain another D-Link, this time with Maleficent, because Terra has the brain of a wild Ericus. Heading back down into the main hall area sees us meeting face to face with the boss of this world already, Wheelmaster. This battle might have been an actual challenge if we were anyone else, but Terra in the Ventus D-Link puts out so much damage that we can absolutely decimate him. I would say we still need to be careful in terms of our health, but each part of the boss we destroy spawns enough health orbs for a large heal, so it's less about being careful and more about just not being as stupid as Terra often is. Once again, beating this world gets us the Fairy Star's Keyblade. It exchanges one muscle for one brain, so we throw it in the trash. Next up is Castle of Dreams, and immediately we're forced into a fight where we need to defeat a bunch of Unversed. If we're not safe about this fight can actually be more threatening than the last boss, particularly if, like me, you were trying to level the Maleficent D-Link to see what it offered, so just be careful and you'll be through it in no time. Once that's over, we're free to explore until we get to the top of the castle steps. This is the second worst part of the run for me. Remember how we had to escort Jacques with Aqua and Snow White with Ventus? Yeah, here we're escorting Cinderella. The trick with Jacques, yet again, doesn't work, meaning we have to do it legit. But we also can't use the Ventus D-Link since Cinderella is with us. That means we're greatly underpowered for this section, since we can really only rely on our combos and the limited amount of shotlock uses we have. Cinderella does afford us an area of effect counter if enemies get too close, similar to Avenger Rush when we fought Ventus. This counter, titled Last Dance, is really powerful. The problem is that enemy attacks still often bypass the block that activates the counter, meaning to use the counter, Cinderella will likely still take damage. It doesn't sound particularly bad at first. The biggest issue, besides Last Dance not working how it should, is that there are actually two parts to this escort mission, the hallway and the main hall. And Cinderella's damage is persistent between them, even if you fail the second part and retry. This means to succeed, you have to try extra hard in the hallway to keep her damage as low as possible, and then hope that the bruisers don't spam their butt slam attack over and over. This part isn't impossible so much as it's just a broken mess that relies on luck. If Cinderella was made temporarily invincible immediately after an enemy attack activates Last Dance, it would be fine, but as it stands, you just kind of have to smash your head against it until it works out. When that's finally done with, we can explore and level some more, on our way down a side hall to reach the balcony overhanging the dance hall. Once there, we reach another boss, Symphony Master. Yet again, Terra with the Ventus D-Link totally dominates this fight, so much so that the only strategy I employed was to enter the D-Link and then pick off the instruments before going for the conductor. Done in 30 seconds. Beating this world gives us the Cinderella D-Link and the Stroke of Midnight Keyblade again. This Keyblade also throws out our muscles, so in the garbage it goes. Moving on, we have our final visit to Dwarf Woodlands. After Terra falls for the manipulations of another villain, we're tasked with finding Snow White all the way across the world. Defeat enemies, run past, doesn't matter until you get to the first mandatory fight in the forest clearing area. The only part of this fight that's significantly more dangerous than previous mandatory encounters is the fact that it includes a lot of bruisers at once and a few hair raisers, who can put out a lot of damage very quickly if you're not careful. But other than that, if you're feeling impatient, Ventus D-Link to decimate them all. If you want to make a bit more leveling progress and don't have all of your D-Links topped up like I didn't though, pick one and play it a bit more carefully. Since most of these enemies also drop D-Link orbs, feel free to drop out, max out the gauge, and then re-enter a D-Link for a free heal. Once that's done, we head back to the Magic Mirror Chamber to confront the boss, the Spirit of the Magic Mirror. The same tactics apply here for Terra as they did with Aqua, except that Terra has to be a bit more careful since he lacks the barrier block and the benefits of the cartwheel dodge. But once again, he just puts out so much damage with or without the Ventus D-Link that this fight is trivial. I chose to save the D-Link just in case I needed the heal and ended up not using it because the battle was over so swiftly. Once again, for winning we get the Treasure Trove Keyblade. Finally, we obtain a Keyblade that doesn't deplete our strength, so we equip it purely because an extra point in magic can only help. Now that the world order for every character lines up, from here on we're going to go world by world, highlighting the differences between each playthrough and what each character struggles with the most. So Radiant Garden is next, serving as the midpoint of the game where all three characters meet. For Aqua, this means running through several screens until she eventually meets up with Mickey, and then they're set upon by a wealth of Unverse to defeat. The hardest part of this is the circle of mandrakes that appear, which have some of the most frustrating projectiles in the series. If you're in the wrong spot when you get hit by one, the next one can easily be in the perfect rhythm to stunlock you, and the next until you're finished. What's more, you can't use your shotlock on them if they're buried underground. I sort of did this bit the difficult way, trying to get them all out of the ground and deal with them one by one. But in hindsight, the better option would be to cartwheel by all of them to scare them out of the ground, and then use your shotlock on them all at once while they're vulnerable. Still, this battle is relatively easy at this point if you're smart or careful in your approach. Beating it unlocks the Mickey D-Link for Aqua, and the Destiny's Embrace Keyblade. This raises critical hit chance, keeps our strength the same, and raises our magic by one, so it's a no-brainer. Next up, we head across Radiant Garden to fight a boss alongside Terra and Ventus. This boss has several attacks that can decimate us, but if we focus on our shotlocks, we can actually do loads of damage to the different parts of its body. Once we defeat part of him, it will drop lots of health orbs to keep us alive. If you stay careful, many of its attacks are easily avoidable. Meanwhile, while we can't use D-Links, Ventus and Terra hit like trucks and revive quickly after being taken down. So the only real thing you have to be extra careful of is the attack where parts of the boss start spinning around the arena like a top. This can be hard to judge, come at you fast, and will almost always guarantee an instant death if it hits you. With Aqua though, this thankfully isn't too difficult to dodge through. After this fight, we have the final fight in the world, a solo fight with Ventus. Aqua has done such low damage up to this point that it has been necessary to skip a lot of optional enemies through the world, so as to not risk losing large chunks of progress through the bigger screens. Thankfully, we can make up for that with the Mickey D-Link, which when fully upgraded offers double experience growth, so I grind a bit to get to a level that makes sense for this world, as well as to get a few more passive abilities through melding, namely my remaining combo pluses and air combo pluses. Ventus here is more or less identical to when we fought him with Ventus, the difference being that we're a bit stronger, and since we're alone we can use D-Links. Thanks to Aqua's barrier block, as long as we don't spam the combo button, we can catch him and retaliate with Counterblast most every time he teleports away and attacks. Since his wiliness and the amount of health he has drags this battle out a bit, I saved the Ventus D-Link mostly for healing. Using this link is so fast that we can pretty consistently get swaths of attacks off on Ventus before he teleports, but we also recover so fast from attacks that even when spamming we're still able to dodge away in time, and while the D-Link's original finisher is probably a bit more effective, Air Dive gives you a bit of a breather and allows you to get a few more hits in if you're lucky. Though be careful when you're leaving it, because you'll likely be so far away from Ventus when you land that he'll immediately use his homing fireball attack, which can still wreck us if all of the fireballs land. With patience, you'll take him down. As Ventus, our first fight is with the mid-boss. This goes about the same as it does with Aqua, since we still can't use D-Links here, and our dodge is still extremely powerful. But thanks to Heal Strike, this fight ends up being even easier than it was last time. Whack away at him, don't get greedy, and you'll be done before you know it. After this, we head back to the town square for a fight with a bunch of Unversed. This fight isn't particularly noteworthy, so there's not much value in discussing it. After a few cutscenes, the world is finished, giving us the Frolic Flame Keyblade, which boosts Ventus's magic by 1 while keeping his strength the same. Good enough for me! You might think Terra's version of the world is the hardest because of his gimped dodge, and while Ventus is easier, I wouldn't say Terra has a harder time than Aqua. Terra just does so much damage that sometimes we don't even get the chance to do anything stupid enough to put ourselves in danger. Anyway, right once we enter the world, we're immediately thrust into battle with Unversed. This fight is really similar to the one with Ventus, so there's not much to say. After trekking back to the reactor area, we're once again fighting the mid-boss. The top spin attack is certainly still dangerous, but honestly, our dodge launches us far enough that its painful recovery isn't too much of a detriment in this battle. This boss is down before you know it thanks to the strength of Terra's attacks, combined with the universally high damage output of allies. Finally, we head back toward and past the town square to eventually meet face to face with Braig. Braig is about as difficult as Ventus was, with some attacks that can do decent damage fairly quickly, and a similar emphasis on refusing to sit still. Getting his patterns down is the main thing here, because once you do, most of his attacks are fairly easily avoidable. We have access to D-Links, but they're better saved for a heal here. Many of Braig's attacks just require a well-timed block to defend against, which will also often do a fair chunk of damage to our opponent by reflecting his projectiles back his way. And whenever Braig is in his sniper's perch shooting down at us, if we sit in the right part of the arena, we can catch him with Counter Hammer as he comes back down. Whenever he starts charging up a dark, powerful shot, we can charge up a shot lock of our own. Sometimes this does damage, sometimes it doesn't, but it will always avoid the attack, so it's worth doing. Particularly if you already have access to Damage Siphon to easily refill your focus meter if you take damage. When this fight is over, we get the Dark Volley Shotlock. With the midway point of the game done, we can finish off the rest of the Disney worlds, starting with Disney Town. Thankfully, we can just skip talking about Disney Town though, since the only thing that's required of any of the 3 characters here is that they do their respective minigame, none of which change in this run from a normal playthrough. After that is Olympus Coliseum, which takes a bit of explaining but is also relatively short for each character. All 3 characters end up in a forced fight with Unversed right at the start. Aqua's is at the Coliseum entrance, with Terra and Ventus fighting down in town. For the most part, while the mob configurations are different, the enemies themselves are the same types. This ultimately means they can all do the fights mostly in the same way. Aqua is stuck with Hercules by her side, meaning no D-links, and the same goes for Ventus, who has both Zack and Hercules. But since he's the only one with Heel Strike right now, he actually has the easiest time. The Buckle Bruisers can be a bit tedious to take down without commands, and the Axe Flappers have a similar ranged attack to Mandrakes, meaning they can really put the hurt on us from off-screen, but it shouldn't be too big of an issue overall. Right after this fight, Terra gains access to his second finisher, allowing him to go for Heel Strike. So he takes a slight detour to grind out some melded abilities, including Second Chance and once more for that very reason. Aqua will still have to wait for me to wise up a bit. Next up are the actual arena segments, which for Ventus is really just an easy urn-smashing minigame. The genuine arena fights with Terra and Aqua, though, are surprisingly tight at times, because the timers were designed with the use of commands in mind. However, they're still very much possible if you're smart about it. Both characters have slightly different round configurations, and identical rounds will sometimes appear in a different order. It's not important to go through all of them, though. The hardest part is knowing when the right time is to use shot locks and the Ventus D-Link. Waste shot locks on an easy set of enemies and you might find yourself without enough focus meter when you really need it. And the D-Link you enter carries through each round, but not every round has enemies that drop a lot of D-Link orbs. This means over time, your D-Link gauge will start dropping faster and faster, eventually forcing you out of the link, requiring you to refill it to re-enter a new link, which you might not have time for. Again, if this happens at the wrong time, you're screwed. I found shot locks are the best against a large group of enemies here, or if you're worried about enemies like the spider chests, which can go underground for an eternity, making progress essentially impossible. Terra will also just kind of have an easier time in general because, again, he puts out so much damage. After this, Ventus will have to fight a swarm of jelly shades, which can be a bit dangerous if you don't have Heel Strike, but we do, so it's fine. Terra likewise has two fights with Zack. The first one is a joke. In the second one, he can put down a lot more damage a lot faster, but with Heel Strike, the Ventus D-Link if we really need it, and her own high damage output, he's of little threat to the smart player. Aqua's fight with Zack immediately heads into the harder phase. However, the Ventus D-Link is so fast that he can hardly get in an attack edgewise. She then has to face Ice Titan and Hades at the same time. While you could go for Hades first, Ice Titan loves to spam icicle projectiles, so being anywhere but directly under him is kind of a bad idea. That being said, when you're under him, he likes to stomp around for huge damage, so this fight is a bit of a delicate dance that requires careful use of the block and dodge to survive. As long as you leave Hades alone, he'll largely leave you alone until Ice Titan is done for. Because it's so easy to get hit, it's best to save the Ventus D-Link until you really need the heal, particularly because it's unlikely to last through both Ice Titan and Hades. Even when Hades is the only opponent left, he doesn't do much, but his attacks also put down a fair amount of damage, and he's invincible whenever he's glowing red. I ended up running out of my D-Link even though I was trying to conserve it, and having to carefully finish Hades off with shot locks. He just kept spamming invincibility, forcing me to wait. It was very close, but not too challenging. The important thing we win from this world is the Mark of a Hero Keyblade, which boosts strength by a large amount and also makes crits more powerful. As we head into deep space, Ventus and Terra are both assaulted. Terra needs to survive against a swarm of jelly shades not too dissimilar from the ones that Ventus just fought, and Ventus has to deal with a much bigger enemy known as Metamorphosis. Both of these are just set pieces, and so there's no real threat. Once inside the ship, Aqua has to fight a few unversed to move on, standard practice at this point, and there's not much to note. The same goes for the fight outside with the Glidewinders, and the mandatory unversed fight after that. After some low-gravity platforming, we finally reach her boss, Gantu. With Stitch by her side, Gantu puts up very little threat. He actually ends up being one of the easiest bosses thus far, with the largest difficulty being how awful the camera is when he gets close to Aqua. There's no particular strategy here, just damage him and avoid his attacks. It's that simple. The fight was so easy, in fact, that I ended up not even getting hit and beating him my first try. When the world is over, Aqua receives the Hyperdrive Keyblade, and she's the only one who will use it. At this point, her magic is becoming enough of a threat that the bonus stats in that area are worth the slightly lowered strength. Shot locks should start decimating things now. Ventus actually has a few screens of freedom before he gets to his first required unversed fight. This is in a cramped hallway, but it's still nothing to write home about at this point. In fact, from here forward, unless a mob fight is particularly noteworthy, let's just skip it. In this case, that means we're going straight to the boss, the monster we saw earlier, Metamorphosis. This fight is one that I was a bit worried about. While he doesn't have a lot of health, Metamorphosis is really fast and can hit us from off-screen pretty easily if we're not paying the utmost attention. It's also a bit difficult to fully charge a shot lock against such a quick target. The boss can occasionally go invisible, preventing lock-on. Thankfully, using Stitch's special command can make the boss visible again without much effort, and after that, the fight is more or less guaranteed. None of Terra's exploits here are really noteworthy either, until he reaches his own boss, Experiment 221, and the only reason this fight is noteworthy is because it's a boss. But so is Terra as long as you ignore his dumb brain and just focus on his buff boy muscles and ability to shoot darkness from every orifice. So this battle is over before you know it. Last up for the Disney Worlds is Neverland. As Aqua, we really just need to wander around until we get some cutscenes, before heading back to the camp we started at to face Ventus again. After a couple tries that didn't pan out particularly well, this is where I finally decided to see why I hadn't gotten Heel Strike yet. Remember that I technically did all of these playthroughs with each character one at a time, and Aqua was the first. So at this point, I couldn't quite remember why I hadn't unlocked Heel Strike. Only once I was reminded of how it's obtained did I fast track it for Ventus and Terra later. I guess that's the downside of making a challenge video about a game where you have a million different optional abilities you can try out, rather than getting them all in a set order as you progress like in KH2. Anyway, for this fight with Ventus, I re-equipped the Mark of a Hero Keyblade, since he can so easily avoid shot locks, which is my primary source of magic damage, so having more strength is probably better here. His attack patterns aren't particularly different from the other fights, other than now having the ability to dive underground and chase you, occasionally popping out for an attack. After the final dive, he'll rain a bunch of fireballs randomly in a pretty large radius. This attack isn't particularly dangerous, and yet for some reason I found him quite a bit more difficult here than back in Radiant Garden, or when using Ventus. I think he might have a higher chance of teleporting away mid-combo here, and he does more damage when we make a mistake. Still, the same strategy applies either way, meaning persistence and patience will see us succeed. After that, the world is over for Aqua, earning her the Peter Pan D-Link, the Pixie Petal Keyblade, and the Stormfall Keyblade after a few extra cutscenes play out. While the Pixie Petal offers a large magic boost, Stormfall isn't that far behind, while not cutting into our strength quite as much, so we go with the latter. We're not completely abandoning combos. Ventus's only noteworthy fight in Neverland is right at the end, when we fight Hook. Though similar to Experiment 221, it's only noteworthy because it's a boss. Hook can do decent damage to us, but he's also extremely easy to knock into the water. Doing so forces him to take crocodile damage, and then he stands around in the center of the arena for a bit, allowing us to get in a few free attacks. He can block some of our attacks if he enters a certain stance, which forces us to take counter damage, but otherwise he's a pushover because our combos and the crocodile both eat him alive. after a plethora of cutscenes, we gain the Lost Memory Keyblade, which we equip partially because of its monstrously powerful stats, and partially because it's one of the better looking Keyblades in the series. Terra also, again, only has one noteworthy fight in Neverland, which asks him to square off against Peter Pan like a total moron. Peter's heart honestly isn't in the fight, because while he can take out nearly half of our health with a single attack, he mostly just flies around doing nothing but being a punching bag. We then have another brief fight with a bunch of jelly shades, before the world just kind of ends. Shortly after, we get the ends of the Earth Keyblade and the Pixie Petal. We equip the former purely because it boosts magic without depleting our strength, though we won't keep it on for long. From here forward is where things can start to get hard. Terra's story in particular turns a complete 180 and ends up easily the most difficult of the three. Before everyone goes to the Badlands for their respective final confrontations, though, Dumb Brain Terra has to confront the person he got the dumb brain from, Ericus. This fight starts us in the Dark Impulse command style, meaning it's one of the only times in the entire run where we actually get to use a command style at all. Unfortunately, while it does good damage, it's not particularly safe, since Ericus can freely and randomly just break through any of our combos for an unjustified punish. So instead, we have to tiptoe around him, focus on blocking him and countering to max out Dark Impulse, and then use its finisher to get it out of here. Ericus has two attacks where he'll charge up projectiles of sorts. One of them has him spawn a ring of spinning blades around himself before he shoots them all out and they home in on Terra. You have to kind of hope you're in the right spot to block them correctly. Doing so will do a good amount of damage to Ericus as you reflect them back, but it's not uncommon for some of them to sneak above or around your guard, wrecking your health and ensuring the rest of them also hit you. The other charged attack has him shoot several orbs at Terra. When you see the tell for this, get up close and reflect them all back at him. These are the safest attacks to use to really damage Ericus. His combos and dash are really dangerous, and he can often spam them back to back to back. He then has two sort of desperation moves he can use. The first shoots spoked lasers out that rotate around him. This is a good chance to get in a shot lock for some free damage. The other spawns fire pillars that start chasing you. This attack is pretty easy to avoid, but it's extremely unwise to go on the offensive during it. Ericus also likes to just stand around and do nothing but stare at you menacingly, baiting you into attacks you don't want to take if you want to avoid being countered into oblivion. And you can't use D-links here either for some reason, making this fight a pretty serious war of attrition. Still, if you just pay attention, don't get greedy, and stay a safe distance away, eventually you'll come out on top. It's not easy, but it's doable. Once that loser's dead, we gain the Chaos Ripper Keyblade, which has such awful magic that it actually takes 2 points away. Apparently, defeating the OG Dumb Brain just makes Terra's Dumb Brain dumber. But in return, we get 5 extra points of strength over our second strongest Keyblade. Definitely worth it. Now we're finally to the closing sections for each character. All that's left for the main game is the final boss gauntlet that's unique for each member of the trio. The question is whether or not the heightened difficulty of the fights will overcome our bag of tricks or not. Thankfully, there's nothing in the actual Badlands section that's mandatory, meaning we can skip straight to the bosses themselves. Once again, we'll do Aqua first, whose initial fight is with Braig. This version of Braig is a bit different from the one we fought as Terra earlier. He's got a new desperation move where he shoots some normal projectiles at us, teleports a bunch, and then appears at the center of the arena and shoots a bunch of dark projectiles that can't be blocked. This attack isn't a particular threat as long as you don't try to block the dark projectiles. In exchange, he seems to be missing his sniper perch attack. Otherwise, he's more or less the same, only he hits harder. That means he's actually easier since we're using Aqua with her superior dodge and guard options. Doubly so since Aqua's magic is so high now that her Prism Rain shotlock does literal bars of damage if you hit all of the prompts, even moderately well. We're also free to use the Ventus D-Link, if we really want to, though with Heal Strike as our finisher, I'd actually recommend against that. Braig, similar to Ventus, likes to freely teleport out of combos and gank you, meaning it's probably better to just use the D-Link for a single heal if you're super desperate, and then immediately drop back out. Let Braig hurt himself with his own projectiles and use your shot lock when you have an opening, and he's done for. Up next is Ventus with the Keyblade and Mickey by our side. Once again, this is relatively similar to our early fight with Ventus in the Badlands, while playing as Ventus. The catch? He teleports out of attacks a lot less now, making this version arguably easier than the others. Even Heal Strike does great damage to him now, because he just tanks it, on top of the heals we get. His movements are more chaotic, and obviously he hits like a freaking train, but since he forgot how to dodge, we don't have to play his dumb games anymore. The only new attack that I saw that was unique to this version of the fight is one where he rips off Cloud by dashing around the arena with his Keyblade pointed forward. His other changes are ones we'll get into in a later fight, where they're more relevant. Mickey asks you to join in on Burst of Faith regularly here, since the arena is a lot smaller than the last Ventus fight he was involved in, meaning you're nearby Mickey enough to activate it more often. This can both do minor damage and keep you safe from a few attacks, so go for it. It also fills your focus gauge, which allows you to shotlock him into another dimension whenever you're done playing around. Once the cutscenes are over, you'll know that you didn't fall asleep at the wheel and start cheating at the challenge if your most used command style is nothing. At least, that's the way it works for Aqua and Ventus' main stories. We'll get to why Terra is the exception a bit later, which some of you might have already caught on to. Anyway, next up is Ventus, whose first battle is just against plain old Ventus. The main new addition here is the attack we've all seen a million times in KH3, where Ventus summons a surfboard made of dusty keyblades. He shoots some projectiles at you occasionally while he's up there, but otherwise this attack just kind of wastes your time. A lot of your time. Oh my god, is it over yet? It goes on forever, seriously! This version of Ventus still knows how to dodge though, so he has to be fought the old-fashioned way. Ventus here ultimately has a really low health pool, meaning this is clearly just a teaser. And as expected, once he goes down, we're met with something that's supposed to be harder. Unfortunately, Osaka team underestimated how frustrating it is when bosses can arbitrarily teleport out of your attacks, and how much more enjoyable / consistent / easy a boss becomes when they don't do that near as often. This version of Ventus more or less has a completely new moveset. He'll power up and then do a slashing combo that ends with him sending an energy beam in the shape of an X at you. He'll do spin attacks, he'll do sets of jumping dashes surrounded by energy, he'll do extended combos that have consistent moments where he teleports and then seamlessly continues the onslaught, and he'll on rare occasion teleport out of your combo and do something similar to the aforementioned spin attack. However, most of these moves can be blocked for a huge vulnerability period and a bunch of command meter charge, allowing you to use Heal Strike regularly for tons of damage and free health. This fight might seem like the hardest version of Ventus at first, but trust me, it's the easiest once you learn it. The next part though is the one that had me worried this challenge was actually impossible. This isn't really supposed to be a boss so much as a set-piece victory lap, where you clash energy with Ventus a bit before ultimately taking him down. Unfortunately, there are two major problems here. Firstly, if you lose, you have to do the previous fight again, making it pretty tedious to finish. And secondly, we're automatically thrust into a gimmick command style, the Ventus command style, with a bunch of bespoke commands to use. Your ultimate goal is simply to get your command gauge all the way up to use a finishing attack. At first, I thought you'd be required to use the commands to raise your command gauge. After all, your commands don't fill the gauge at all. Thankfully, this turned out to not be the case. Unfortunately, not using them makes this battle very, very RNG heavy, because you're completely at the mercy of what Ventus' AI wants to do. He must have heard us making fun of his inability to dodge, because here he starts dodging like crazy. Not really through teleports, but rather through extremely fast, unblockable slashes and dashes. Our goal is therefore to use our one remaining option to raise the command meter: shotlocks. If you're lucky, he'll play ball and go into an energy clash quick-time event that's easy to win. This will fill the command meter around a third of the way. If you're not lucky, he'll go into one of his attacks, dodging the entire shot lock and wasting a large amount of the focus meter. On top of that, your command meter will start depleting if you don't keep on the offensive. Since we can't heal here, we only have so many chances to use shot lock before we're out of real options. He can just tank our combo attacks, shrug them off, and then knock our lights out. And again, physical attacks don't actually fill the command gauge, so physically attacking him is only useful as a last resort in order to gain a bit more focus meter. This fight was a nightmare, and was easily the most annoying bit of the run, dethroning the Cinderella escort mission. Succeeding is only a matter of time and persistence, but boy is it not a fun time having to redo the previous fight over and over just for a shot at this roulette wheel of pain. The only thing I didn't try that, in hindsight, might have made it more consistent was not charging my shot lock all the way. I realized right at the end of my successful attempt that you can just immediately enter the shot lock after you've charged it a tiny bit, and it will still cause the same clash effect. Doing it this way the whole time should mean that you end up having several more chances to get Ventus to take the bait. Regardless, when it's over, we've won, and once again we can see Ventus has 0 command styles entered. I guess the Ventus command style doesn't count. Finally, we have the Terra segment. If that Ventus fight we just did is the most frustrating part of the run, this fight ends up easily being the hardest part of the run. To start, we have a fight against Ventus for the billionth time. This round though, he's with Xehanort. The old man mostly just stands there if you leave him alone, but the opposite isn't true if you target him first, so go after Ventus initially. Thankfully, Terra's damage output is so high, and we're so accustomed to this battle, that Ventus falls apart at the slightest glare. After that, we're just left with Xehanort by himself. Xehanort must be where all of the villains learn to teleport constantly, though he's so old that he only does it on occasion. This means consistent damage is really easy to find. His attacks are rather slow as well, and he doesn't have a lot of options. A few spells that can be easily dodged, a couple of combos that can be blocked and countered, and he'll occasionally throw those gross, dusty Keyblade corpses at us. But once again, Terra lifts at the gym daily, so this fight really is quick and easy. One of the least threatening up to this point. It's only after this fight that things get brutal. This fight against Terra Xehanort was the one that took me the longest across the game, probably around 2 hours. While we do decent damage either way, so does Terranort. On a technical level, most of this battle is actually pretty easy to deal with, even though there are some small inconsistencies with it that frustrate me personally. Many of Terranort's combos and attacks can be blocked and countered for large amounts of damage, as well as a boost toward getting an easy heal strike. However, this is only really true if Terranort decides to stagger from the block, which is inconsistent. Sometimes blocking an attack will send him reeling. Sometimes blocking the exact same attack will see him blazing right through it into more attacks. There's no way I could find to know which he'll do, meaning you have to be extra careful and tediously slow with your counters, or you'll get hit. Terranort does do some other attacks, like a more powerful combo that uses the Dark Impulse command style and its finisher. He can also summon giant earth spikes, dash around like we can with Sonic Impact, and use Dark Volley projectiles, the latter of which can thankfully be reflected back at him. If we get caught by any of these attacks, we're usually caught by the entire barrage, which will all but completely deplete our health. Thankfully, he's still consistent enough that it's rare that this'll end up in failure before you can put together a heal strike to undo the major part of the damage. Unfortunately, this is all complemented by 2 other options Terranort has that can make the fight infuriating when you have such limited healing options. Firstly, Terranort can freely heal away some of the damage you've inflicted using curative spells. I like that we're effectively fighting a pseudo version of our own character. Therefore, I was actually hoping he would only have Cure if you came into the battle with it, as if he stole Terra's kit along with his body. How cool would it be if he could only use that spell as many times as you had it in your command deck? But no, he just has it no matter what, and I think he can use it like 3 or 4 times total, healing the equivalent of his entire health pool over the course of the fight if you let him. The other problem is his Meteor Desperation move, which as far as I could find is only avoidable using one tactic, getting off a shot lock. However, when you try this, he teleports around everywhere to avoid your lock on. You also have to enter the shot lock at the right time. Don't time it right and you're down to 1 HP basically no matter what. Of course, all of this is contingent on you not getting hit by the meteors while they're popping out of the ground, which don't seem to have any tell that allows you to avoid them. So they'll sometimes just appear out of nowhere, sending you to 1 HP early, and guaranteeing that if you don't get the shot lock off at the right time, you're done for. The shot lock doesn't even really do anything either, because like earlier Ventus fights, he'll just dodge through it all. But even if you do get the shot lock off, the recovery period can allow Terra to send dark volley projectiles or unblockable attacks your way, potentially tagging you and ending you before you can really do anything. It's extremely frustrating because you don't have access to D-Links here for a free heal. Once he gets to half health, Terra can use this meteor move basically whenever he wants, meaning on rare occasions, he'll more or less use it back to back, before you get enough time to gain a heal strike to get above 1 HP again. There is a chance I was doing something wrong here that would have greatly helped even the odds, but I couldn't find a solution. Regardless, eventually I did prevail, after leaving to grab Dark Screen and Fire Screen to lessen his damage dealing potential slightly. As you'll see, Terra's end screen says that I used Dark Impulse 14 times, which was purely because he was forced into it at the beginning of every Ericus fight, but other than that, not a single battle command was used. Now that all of that is done, we only have 2 more short post-game chapters to tackle. These had me incredibly worried, particularly after that last fight with Terra, since we have to face him again. So I started off final chapter by grinding with Aqua a bit, so that she was no longer underleveled, and I got her access to things like Dark Screen and Fire Screen. Thankfully, while the first fight with Terra here still took a few tries, it wasn't as bad as the one we just did, once again due to her barrier block and cartwheel. Heal Strike is still really easy to get if you focus on blocking and countering. The counters do a decent amount of damage, as does Heal Strike. In fact, if you can catch Terra in the middle of an attack, Heal Strike can sometimes do nearly a whole bar of damage alone. And using your shot lock does massive damage too, particularly with the Keyblade we get that's unique to this chapter, Bright Crest, which offers us an enormous pool of magic, fair strength, and makes crits more frequent and more powerful. Terra can still heal himself a few times and still uses a variation of his meteor attack, but that's of little threat considering we can just cartwheel through it. It also does far less damage for some reason, possibly since this is only phase 1 of the fight. Once you beat the standard Terra fight, we face the one that's more like Ansem or Terra's KH3 form, with the chained Heartless backing him up. This fight would be a lot more brutal if it wasn't for one caveat. As long as you catch him right, this form doesn't dodge a single hit from your shot lock, allowing you to take out half of his health with a single use. Granted, if you do it at the wrong time, he'll dodge literally all of it, but at least that's more consistent, making timing it a part of the challenge, rather than leaving it to dumb luck. He also just sort of takes whatever damage you dish out with other attacks, making damage dealing as a whole pretty consistent as long as you can stay alive. He can still avoid flinching and randomly start an attack you can't dodge, but I'd argue that's kind of your fault for being greedy. Most of this form's attacks rely on the Heartless backing him up, whether it's shooting at you from underground like a missile, shooting a pair of energy pillar attacks at you, or throwing a pair of dark orbs, simply swiping at you when you get too close, or briefly grabbing you, allowing Terra himself to start an inescapable Keyblade combo. He also has a rather weak desperation move of sorts, where he transports you to another dimension to throw a bunch of energy balls at you until you can make it to Terra's body and hit him. Surprisingly, we can use the Ventus D-Link here, which makes you question why you couldn't when playing as Lingering Will, or when fighting Ericus, but considering the damage output of Terra in this fight, it's once again smart to relegate the D-Link strictly to a heal and maybe a combo or two if you're feeling spicy. You really don't want to go long without the ability to use Heal Strike. Still, because he's so unwilling to avoid damage in this phase, this fight actually ends up being easier than the previous one. With that chapter done, we only have the secret chapter remaining, where Aqua is lost in the realm of darkness with nothing but Ericus's Keyblade to keep her company. Luckily, this Keyblade gives us the same enormous boost in magic that the Bright Crest did, but also gives us an equal boost to strength, meaning it's a damage-dealing powerhouse. This chapter isn't particularly complicated, since we only have 3 generic enemy types to fight, and then a single boss. As we explore, we'll run across pools of darkness. When we get close, Heartless start pouring out, namely Shadows, Neo-Shadows, and the occasional Dark Ball. They can really do a lot of damage, but they tend to bunch up, making it easy to both gain access to Heal Strike and to dish out mountains of damage with it. Defeating all of the enemies from a specific pool will usually expand the level in some way, giving us the chance to explore more. This takes around a half an hour or so before we finally reach the boss of the chapter, Darkhide. When the battle starts, Darkhide will stalk us from the shadows. Eventually, the screen will go red and show Aqua in slow motion, from Darkhide's perspective. Guard will block his attack once he gets close, and then we can counterblast to punish. He'll do this a few times before really showing himself. Shotlocks do more damage than ever here, with the first blast alone from Prism Rain doing around 2 bars of damage at around level 35. Darkhide jumps around a lot and attacks quickly, so if you're at low health, you need to be ready to guard at a moment's notice. Greed is exceedingly dangerous here, so take your time, try to focus on getting heal strikes for safety, and use shotlocks whenever it is safe. This is more difficult than it sounds, particularly when Darkhide starts duplicating himself and attacking multiple times in succession, so it's not like Prism Rain is an easy gimme, and thankfully it doesn't need to be, because other than spinning, slashing, and throwing the odd Dark Orb, Darkhide doesn't really do much that isn't predictable or able to be countered by a skilled player. At some point he'll enter a desperation move where he spins around the arena and then dashes through the center a few times, which can be dangerous if you're playing around, but cartwheel consistently and he's harmless. This is when he'll duplicate himself, meaning he's much more capable of taking you down if you let him hit you. Just play carefully and wait for an opportunity to attack. Just 3 or so shotlocks will take him down from full health, even less if you've been getting in some good pokes and heal strikes along the way. Eventually, Darkhide will go down, and the run is finally over. I can't say I'm particularly surprised that this challenge was possible, nor that it was largely so easy. As I said up top, Birth by Sleep is a hilariously broken game with the right options, which is why I tried to avoid just spamming nothing but rolls, cartwheels, and shotlocks, and instead tried to include other options. But it's a bit of a shame the Ventus D-Link is also so powerful, because some of the others have abilities I would have liked to have utilized more, but I never got a reason to do so. Still, when you remove options like Magnet, Thunder, Mind Square, Cure, and the various Surge abilities, Birth by Sleep does get a fair bit more strategic. Relying on actual mechanics instead of press triangle to win was more satisfying than a usual playthrough, and actually made the fact that you're effectively playing through the same exact game 3 times a bit less noticeable. The differences between each playthrough stood out more when I wasn't using the same exact tactic with every character in every fight, and hopefully now that the game is being ported to PC, full-scale mods can push it much further than hacks of the PSP version ever could have. In a few years, we might be able to see a version of Birth by Sleep that's truly great mechanically, no caveats like this required. You could obviously push this challenge further if you wanted. Like I said in the beginning, people have done no ability, no command, level 1 crit runs, but I think this is a fair compromise that makes the game a bit more strategic and demanding without removing all of the mechanics and options and turning it into a tedious test of very exact, precise movements and AI manipulations. The only thing I missed was command styles, if only because I think strategizing around them could have been fun. But even using Ice Cream to enter them is technically against the rules, which is unfortunate. Still, this was a decent ride nonetheless. Before you go, if you're interested in other Kingdom Hearts content, I have a review of Kingdom Hearts 3 from when it was released. I revisit it when Remind came out to discuss the new update, Remind itself, and Critical Mode. And if you somehow didn't see it, I also have a KH2 challenge where I try to beat the game without using Keyblade combos. If you're interested in other Square games, I have a plethora of videos on Final Fantasy, like a review of Final Fantasy VII Remake, a review of the original Final Fantasy VII, and more. Beyond that, there's 6+ years of content you can check out, ranging from editorials on indie games to reviews of big budget titles. Anyway, what did you guys think? Are there any challenges like this you think would be fun to try? Is this challenge something you think you might want to try? Are there any strategies you know of you think could improve on what was done here without making the gameplay itself? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.